Hello, everyone. Welcome. You're here, and it's obviously bedtime. Getting a little bit of a later start than I wanted to. I was busy for a few minutes. So bear with me as I tab through a couple things real quick. You'll forgive me? Okay. Well, I appreciate that. I need all the forgiveness I can get, that's for sure. Uh-oh. Apparently I'm still set to mature settings. Let me fix that really quick. There we go. All right, perfect. What was the eight ball's verdict? Do I get forgiven by the eight ball or no? Oh, this eight ball is out to get me. I'm gonna have to calibrate this eight ball. Have to adjust its settings a little bit, I think. Hey, little dude. Hey, Sparky. Glad you're here. Well, there you go. Obviously, I need to recalibrate the eight ball. Tell it exactly what I expect from it. But yeah, I got to spend part of my morning working with a teenage girl on trigonometry. It didn't go well. It did not go well at all. Yep. But I'm here now, and this will be a much better morning now that I'm here and with you. And I've got my Darjeeling, and I've got a great book, and I've got good company with all of you. And so we'll have a nice way to ease into the rest of the day, or into the evening for a significant chunk of you. So grab something hot, relax, lay back, and let's read a good old story. When we left off with Mr. Nickleby, he had just had a very awkward, date's maybe not the right word for it, but evening of verbal intercourse with the young Miss Squeers and her, I guess, frenemy at this point, and her frenemy's Yorkshire fiance, and had navigated it rather poorly. Well, even after he figured out what was going on, he didn't handle it the best, and he was flirting quite a bit with the young woman that brought her fiance along. Bit of arrogance on his part, cockiness, enjoying the attention of a attractive young woman, as you know, opposed to Miss Squeers, who it seems is rather odious in personal appearance and personality, much like the rest of her family. We also learned that the young Master Squeers is being groomed to take over the school, which would rather effectively put paid to Nickleby's dreams of running the school after Mr. Squeers retired or passed on, and showing that his uncle's suggestions for the grand opportunity that this was were a complete fabrication. His sister was taking employment with a um, milliner. That's right, they called it a milliner, a dressmaker, who I think some of us suspected was more in the inappropriate entertainment industry, shall we say, but might actually just be a sweatshop where they work the young women very hard and then pay them next to nothing. So we will find that out this evening, I believe. The next chapter is chapter 12, and we'll go ahead and jump into that. Chapter 12, whereby the reader will be enabled to trace the further course of Miss Fanny Squeer's love, and to ascertain whether it ran smooth or otherwise. I'm betting on otherwise. It was a fortunate circumstance for Miss Fanny Squeers that when her worthy papa returned home on the night of the small tea party, he was what the initiated term too far gone to observe the numerous tokens of extreme vexation of spirit which were plainly visible in her countenance. Being, however, of a rather violent and quarrelsome mood in his cups, it is not impossible that he might have fallen out with her, either on this or some imaginary topic, if the young lady had not, with a foresight and prudence highly commendable, kept a boy up on purpose to bear the first brunt of the good gentleman's anger, which, having vented itself in a variety of kicks and cuffs, subsided sufficiently to admit of his being persuaded to go to bed, which he did with his boots on and an umbrella under his arm. So the bastard came home drunk, and rather than bearing his anger herself, she foisted it off on one of the kids. Man, these people. The hungry servant attended Miss Squeers in her own room, according to custom, to curl her hair, perform the other little offices of her toilet, and administer as much flattery as she could get up for the purpose. For Miss Squeers was quite lazy enough, and sufficiently vain and frivolous withal, to have been a fine lady, and it was only the arbitrary distinctions of rank and station which prevented her from being one. "How lovely your hair do curl tonight, miss," said the handmaid. "I declare if it isn't a pity and a shame to brush it out." "Hold your tongue," replied Miss Squeers wrathfully. Some considerable experience prevented the girl from being at all surprised at any outbreak of ill temper on the part of Miss Squeers. Having a half perception of what had occurred in the course of the evening, she changed her mode of making herself agreeable, and proceeded on the indirect tack. "Well, I couldn't help saying, miss, if you was to kill me for it," said the attendant, "that I never seen nobody look so vulgar as Miss Price this night." Miss Squeers sighed, and composed herself to listen. "I know it is very wrong in me to say so, miss," continued the girl, delighted to see the impression she was making. "Miss Price being a friend of yourn, and all, but she do dress herself out so, and go on in such a manner to get noticed, that, oh, well, if people only saw themselves." "What do you mean, Fib?" asked Miss Squeers, looking in her own little glass, where, like most of us, she saw not herself, but the reflection of some pleasant image in her own brain. "How you talk." "Talk, miss. It's enough to make a tomcat talk French grammar, only to see how she tosses her head," replied the handmaid. "She does toss her head," observed Miss Squeers, with an air of abstraction. "So vain and so very, very plain," said the girl. "Poor Tilda," sighed Miss Squeers compassionately. "And always laying herself out so, to get to be admired," pursued the servant. "Oh dear, it's positive indelicate." "I can't allow you to talk in that way, Fib," said Miss Squeers. "Tilda's friends are low people, and if she don't know any better, it's their fault and not hers." "Well, but you know, miss," said Phoebe, for which the name Fib was used as a patronizing abbreviation, "if she was only to take a copy by a friend, oh, if she only knew how wrong she was, and would but set herself right by you, what a nice young woman she might be in time." "Fib," rejoined Miss Squeers, with a stately air, "it is not proper for me to hear these comparisons drawn. They make Tilda look like a coarse, improper sort of person, and it seems unfriendly in me to listen to them. I would rather you dropped the subject, Fib. At the same time, I must say that if Tilda Price would take pattern by somebody, not me particularly—" "Oh, yes, you, miss," interposed Fib. "Well, me, Fib, if you would have it so. said Miss Squeers. "I must say that if she would be all the better for it." "So somebody else thinks, sir, I am much mistaken," said the girl mysteriously. "What do you mean?" demanded Miss Squeers. "Never mind, miss," replied the girl. "I know what I know, that's all." "Fib," said Miss Squeers dramatically. "I insist upon you explaining yourself. What is this dark mystery? Speak." "Why, if you will have it, miss, it's this," said the servant girl. "Mr. John Brody thinks as you think, and if he wasn't too far gone to do it credible, he'd be very glad to be off with Miss Price and on with Miss Squeers." "Gracious heavens!" exclaimed Miss Squeers, clasping her hands with great dignity. "What is this?" "Truth, ma'am, and nothing but truth," replied the artful Fib. "What a situation!" cried Miss Squeers. "On the brink of unconsciously destroying the peace and happiness of my own Tilda. What is the reason that men fall in love with me, whether I like it or not, and desert their chosen intendeds for my sake?" "Because they can't help it, miss," replied the girl. "The reason's plain." If Miss Squeers were the reason, it was very plain. "Never let me hear of it again," retorted Miss Squeers. "Never. Do you hear? Tilda Price has faults, many faults, but I wish her well, and above all I wish her married, for I think it highly desirable, most desirable from the very nature of her failings, that she should be married as soon as possible. No, Fib, let her have Mr. Brody. I may pity him, poor fellow, but I have a great regard for Tilda, and only hope she may make a better wife than I think she will." With this effusion of feeling, Miss Squeers went to bed. Spite is a little word, but it represents as strange a jumble of feelings and compound of discords as any polysyllable in the language. Miss Squeers knew as well in her heart of hearts that what the miserable serving girl had said was sheer, coarse, lying flattery, as did the girl herself. Yet the mere opportunity of venting a little ill nature against the offending Miss Price, and affecting to compassionate her weaknesses and foibles, though only in the presence of a solitary dependent, was almost as great a relief to her spleen as if the whole had been gospel truth. Nay, more. We have such extraordinary powers of persuasion when they are exerted over ourselves. The Miss Squeers felt quite high-minded and great after her noble renunciation of John Brody's hand, and looked down upon her rival with a kind of holy calmness and tranquillity that had a mighty effect in soothing her ruffled feelings. This happy state of mind had some influence in bringing about a reconciliation, for when a knock came at the front door next day, and the miller's daughter was announced, Miss Squeers betook herself to the parlor in a Christian frame of spirit, perfectly beautiful to behold. "Well, Fanny," said the miller's daughter, "you see I have come to see you, although we had some words last night." "I pity your bad passions, Tilda," replied Miss Squeers, "but I bear no malice. I am above it." "Don't be cross, Fanny," said Miss Price. "I have come to tell you something that I know will please you." "What may that be, Tilda?" demanded Miss Squeers, screwing up her lips, and looking as if nothing in air, earth, fire, or water could afford her the slightest gleam of satisfaction. "This," rejoined Miss Price. "After we left here last night, John and I had a dreadful quarrel." "That doesn't please me," said Miss Squeers, relaxing into a smile, though. "Lor, I wouldn't think so bad of you as to suppose it did," rejoined her companion. "That's not it." "Oh," said Miss Squeers, relapsing into melancholy. "Go on." "After a great deal of wrangling, and saying we would never see each other any more," continued Miss Price, "we made it up, and this morning John went down and wrote our names to be put up for the first time next Sunday. So we shall be married in 3 weeks, and I give you notice to get your frock made." There was mingled gall and honey in this intelligence. The prospect of the friends being married so soon was the gall, and the certainty of her not entertaining serious designs upon Nicholas was the honey. Upon the whole, the sweet greatly preponderated over the bitter, so Miss Squeers said she would get the frock made, and that she hoped Tilda might be happy, though at the same time she didn't know, and would not have her build too much upon it, for men were strange creatures, and a great many married women were very miserable, and wished themselves single again with all their hearts. To which condolences Miss Squeers added others equally calculated to raise her friend's spirits and promote her cheerfulness of mind. "But come now, Fanny," said Miss Price. "I want to have a word or two with you about young Mr. Nickleby." "He is nothing to me," interrupted Miss Squeers, with hysterical symptoms. "I despise him too much." "Oh, you don't mean that, I am sure," replied her friend. "Confess, Fanny, don't you like him now?" Without returning any direct reply, Miss Squeers, all at once, fell into a paroxysm of spiteful tears, and exclaimed that she was a wretched, neglected, miserable castaway. "I hate everybody," said Miss Squeers, "and I wish everybody was dead, that I do." "Dear, dear," said Miss Price, quite moved by this avowal of misanthropical sentiments. "You're not serious, I'm sure." "Yes, I am," rejoined Miss Squeers, tying tight knots in her pocket handkerchief and clenching her teeth. "And I wish I was dead, too. There!" "Oh, you'll think very differently in another 5 minutes," said Matilda. "How much better to take him into favor again than to hurt yourself by going on in that way? Wouldn't it be much nicer now to have him all to yourself, on good terms, in a company-keeping, love-making, pleasant sort of manner?" "I don't know but what it would," sobbed Miss Squeers. "Oh, Tilda, how could you have acted so mean and dishonorable? I wouldn't have believed it of you if anybody had told me." "Hey day!" exclaimed Miss Price, giggling. "One would suppose I had been murdering somebody at least." "Very nigh as bad," said Miss Squeers passionately. "And all this because I happen to have enough of good looks to make people civil to me," cried Miss Price. "Persons don't make their own faces, and it's no more my fault if mine is a good one than it is other people's fault if theirs is a bad one." "Hold your tongue!" shrieked Miss Squeers in her shrillest tone, "or you'll make me slap you, Tilda, and afterwards I should be sorry for it." It is needless to say that, by this time, the temper of each young lady was in some slight degree affected by the tone of her conversation, and that a dash of personality was infused into the altercation in consequence. Indeed, the quarrel, from slight beginnings, rose to a considerable height, and was assuming a very violent complexion, when both parties, falling into a great passion of tears, exclaimed simultaneously that they had never thought of being spoken to in that way, which exclamation, leading to a remonstrance, gradually brought on an explanation, and the upshot was that they fell into each other's arms and vowed eternal friendship, the occasion in question making the 52nd time of repeating the same impressive ceremony within a 12-month. So apparently this is a weekly thing with them. Perfect amicability being thus restored, a dialogue naturally ensued upon the number and nature of the garments which would be indispensable for Miss Price's entrance into the holy state of matrimony, when Miss Squeers clearly showed that a great many more than the miller could or would afford were absolutely necessary, and could not be decently dispensed with. The young lady then, by an easy digression, led the discourse to her own wardrobe, and after recounting its principal beauties at some length, took her friend upstairs to make inspection thereof. The treasures of 2 drawers in a closet having been displayed, and all the smaller articles tried on, it was time for Miss Price to return home, and as she had been in raptures with all the frocks, and had been stricken quite dumb with the admiration of a new pink scarf, Miss Squeers said in high good humour that she would walk part of the way with her, for the pleasure of her company, and off they went together. Miss Squeers dilating, as they walked along, upon her father's accomplishments, and multiplying his income by 10, to give her friend some faint notion of the vast importance and superiority of her family. It happened that that particular time, comprising the short daily interval which was suffered to elapse between what was pleasantly called the dinner of Mr. Squeers' pupils and their return to the pursuit of useful knowledge, was precisely the hour when Nicholas was accustomed to issue forth for a melancholy walk, and to brood, as he sauntered listlessly through the village, upon his miserable lot. Miss Squeers knew this perfectly well, but had perhaps forgotten it, for when she caught sight of that young gentleman advancing toward them, she evinced many symptoms of surprise and consternation, and assured her friend that she felt fit to drop into the earth. "Shall we turn back, Or run into a cottage? Asked Miss Price. He don't see us yet. No, Tilda. It is my duty to go through with it, and I will. As Miss Squeers said this, in the tone of one who has made a high moral resolution, and was besides taken with one or two chokes and catchings of breath, indicative of feelings at a high pressure, her friend made no further remark, and they bore straight down upon Nicholas, who, walking with his eyes bent upon the ground, was not aware of their approach until they were close upon him. Otherwise he might, perhaps, have taken shelter himself. I wonder if he would have sung Run Away when he did it. He is going, murmured Miss Squeers. I shall choke. Come back, Mr. Nickleby, do, cried Miss Price, affecting alarm at her friend's threat, but really actuated by a malicious wish to hear what Nicholas would say. Come back, Mr. Nickleby. Mr. Nickleby came back, and looked as confused as might be as he inquired whether the ladies had any commands for him. Don't stop to talk, urged Miss Price hastily, but support her on the other side. How do you feel now, dear? Better, sighed Miss Squeers, laying a beaver bonnet of a reddish brown with a green veil attached on Mr. Nickleby's shoulder. This foolish faintness. Don't call it foolish, dear, said Miss Price, her bright eye dancing with merriment as she saw the perplexity of Nicholas. You have no reason to be ashamed of it. It's those who are too proud to come round again without all this to do that ought to be ashamed. You were resolved to fix it upon me, I see, said Nicholas, smiling, although I told you last night it was not my fault. There, he says it was not his fault, my dear, remarked the wicked Miss Price. Perhaps you were too jealous or too hasty with him. He says it was not his fault. You hear? I think that's apology enough. You will not understand me, said Nicholas. Pray dispense with this jesting, for I have no time, and really no inclination, to be the subject or promoter of mirth just now. What do you mean? Asked Miss Price, affecting amazement. Don't ask him, Tilda, cried Miss Squeers. I forgive him. Dear me, said Nicholas, as the brown bonnet went down on his shoulder again. This is more serious than I supposed. Allow me. Will you have the goodness to hear me speak? Here he raised up the brown bonnet, and regarding with most unfeigned astonishment a look of tender reproach from Miss Squeers, shrunk back a few paces to be out of the reach of the fair burden, and went on to say, I am very sorry, truly and sincerely sorry, for having been the cause of any difference among you. Last night I reproach myself most bitterly for having been so unfortunate as to cause the dissension that occurred, although I did so, I assure you, most unwittingly and heedlessly. Well, that's not all you've got to say, surely, exclaimed Miss Price, as Nicholas paused. I fear there's something more, stammered Nicholas, with a half-smile, and looking toward Miss Squeers. It is a most awkward thing to say, but the very mention of such a supposition makes one look like a puppy. Still, may I ask if that lady supposes that I entertain any... In short, does she think that I am in love with her? Delightful embarrassment, thought Miss Squeers. I have brought him to it at last. Answer for me, dear, she whispered to her friend. Does she think so? Rejoined Miss Price. Of course she does. She does, exclaimed Nicholas, with such energy of utterance as might have been, for the moment, mistaken for rapture. Certainly, replied Miss Price. If Mr. Nickleby has doubted that, Tilda, said the blushing Miss Squeers in soft accents, he may set his mind at rest. His sentiments are Stop! Cried Nicholas hurriedly. Pray hear me. This is the grossest and wildest delusion, the completest and most signal mistake that ever human being labored under, or committed. I have scarcely seen the young lady 6 times, but if I had seen her 60 times, or am destined to see her 60,000, it would be and will be precisely the same. I have not one thought, wish, or hope connected with her, unless it be, and I say this, not to hurt her feelings, but to impress her with the real state of my own, unless it be the one object, dear to my heart as life itself, of being one day able to turn my back upon this accursed place, never to set foot in it again, or think of it, even think of it, but with loathing and disgust. Whew. Brutal. With this particularly plain and straightforward declaration, which he made with all the vehemence that his indignant and excited feelings could bring to bear upon it, Nicholas, waiting to hear no more, retreated. But Miss Squeers, her anger, rage, and vexation, the rapid succession of bitter and passionate feelings that whirled through her mind, are not to be described. Refused? Refused by a teacher, picked up by advertisement at an annual salary of £5, payable at indefinite periods, and found in food and lodging like the very boys themselves, and this too in the presence of a little chit of a miller's daughter of 18, who was going to be married in 3 weeks' time, to a man that had gone down on his very knees to ask her. She could have choked in right good earnest at the thought of being so humbled. I mean, it was brutal, but my God, if anyone in any family deserves it, it is the Squeers. The only problem is Nicholas is dependent upon them, so tactically probably not wise. But there was one thing clear in the midst of her mortification, and that was that she hated and detested Nicholas with all the narrowness of mind and littleness of purpose worthy of a descendant of the house of Squeers. And there was one comfort, too, and that was that every hour and every day she could wound his pride and goad him with the infliction of some slight or insult or deprivation, which could not but have some effect on the most insensible person, and must be acutely felt by one so sensitive as Nicholas. With these two reflections uppermost in her mind, Miss Squeers made the best of the matter to her friend, by observing that Mr. Nickleby was such an odd creature, and of such a violent temper, that she feared she should be obliged to give him up, and parted from her. And here it may be remarked that Miss Squeers, having bestowed her affections, or whatever it might be that, in the absence of anything better, represented them, on Nicholas Nickleby, had never once seriously contemplated the possibility of his being of a different opinion from herself in the business. Miss Squeers reasoned that she was prepossessing and beautiful, and that her father was master and Nicholas man, and that her father had saved money, and Nicholas had none, all of which seemed to her conclusive arguments, while the young man should feel only too much honored by her preference. She had not failed to recollect either how much more agreeable she could render his situation if she were his friend, and how much more disagreeable if she were his enemy. And yet, doubtless, many less scrupulous young gentlemen than Nicholas would have encouraged her extravagance, had it been only for this very obvious and intelligible reason. However, he had thought proper to do otherwise, and Miss Squeers was outrageous. "Let him see," said the irritated young lady, when she had regained her own room, and eased her mind by committing an assault on Fib, "if I don't set mother against him a little more when she comes back." It was scarcely necessary to do this, but Miss Squeers was as good as her word, and poor Nicholas, in addition to bad food, dirty lodging, and the being compelled to witness one dull, unvarying round of squalid misery, was treated with every special indignity that malice could suggest, or the most grasping cupidity put upon him. "Hey, Meg, thanks for lurking. I hope your stream's going well today." Nor was this all. There was another and deeper system of annoyance which made his heart sink, and nearly drove him wild by its injustice and cruelty. The wretched creature Smike, since the night Nicholas had spoken kindly to him in the schoolroom, had followed him to and fro, with an ever-restless desire to serve or help him, anticipating such little wants as his humble ability could supply, and content only to be near him. He would sit beside him for hours, looking patiently into his face, and a word would brighten up his careworn visage, and call it into it a passing gleam, even of happiness. He was an altered being. He had an object now, and that object was to show his attachment to the only person, that person a stranger, who had treated him, not to say with kindness, but like a human creature. Upon this poor being all the spleen and ill humor that could not be vented on Nicholas were unceasingly bestowed. Drudgery would have been nothing. Smike was well used to that. Buffetings inflicted without cause would have been equally a matter of course, for to them also he had served a long and weary apprenticeship. But it was no sooner observed that he had become attached to Nicholas, Then stripes and blows, morning, noon, and night, were his only portion. Squeers was jealous of the influence which his man had so soon acquired, and his family hated him, and Smike paid for both. Nicholas saw it, and ground his teeth at every repetition of the savage and cowardly attack. He had arranged a few regular lessons for the boys, and one night, as he paced up and down the dismal schoolroom, his swollen heart almost bursting to think that his protection and countenance should have increased the misery of the wretched being whose particular destitution had awakened his pity, he paused mechanically in a dark corner where sat the object of his thoughts. The poor soul was poring hard over a tattered book, with the traces of recent tears still upon his face, vainly endeavoring to master some task which a child of 9 years old, possessed of ordinary powers, could have conquered with ease, but which to the addled brain of the crushed boy of 19 was a sealed and hopeless mystery. Yet there he sat, patiently conning the page again and again, stimulated by no boyish ambition, for he was the common jest and scoff even of the uncouth objects that congregated about him, but inspired by the one eager desire to please his solitary friend. Nicholas laid his hand upon his shoulder. "I can't do it," said the dejected creature, looking up with bitter disappointment in every feature. No. "Do not try," replied Nicholas. The boy shook his head, and closing the book with a sigh, looked vacantly round, and laid his head upon his arm. He was weeping. "Do not, for God's sake," said Nicholas in an agitated voice. "I cannot bear to see you." "They are more hard with me than ever," sobbed the boy. "I know it," rejoined Nicholas. "They are." "But for you," said the outcast, "I should die. They would kill me, they would. I know they would." "You will do better, poor fellow," replied Nicholas, shaking his head mournfully, "when I am gone." "Gone?" cried the other, looking intently in his face. "Softly," rejoined Nicholas. "Yes." "Are you going?" demanded the boy in an earnest whisper. "I cannot say," replied Nicholas. "I was speaking more to my own thoughts than to you." "Tell me," said the boy imploringly. "Oh, do tell me. Will you go? Will you?" "I shall be driven to that at last," said Nicholas. "The world is before me, after all." "Tell me," urged Smike. "Is the world as bad and dismal as this place?" "Heaven forbid," replied Nicholas, pursuing the train of his own thoughts. "Its hardest, coarsest toil were happiness to this." "Should I ever meet you there?" demanded the boy, speaking with unusual wildness and volubility. "Yes," replied Nicholas, willing to soothe him. "No, said the other, clasping him by the hand. Should I? Tell me that again. Say I should be sure to find you." "You would," replied Nicholas, with the same humane intention, "and I would help and aid you, and not bring fresh sorrow on you, as I have done here." The boy caught both the young man's hands passionately in his, and hugging them to his breast, uttered a few broken sounds which were unintelligible. Squeers entered at the moment, and he shrunk back into his old corner. Oof. Hopefully Nicholas gets out of here soon. Chapter 13. Nicholas varies the monotony of Dotheboys Hall by a most vigorous and remarkable proceeding, which leads to consequences of some importance. The cold, feeble dawn of a January morning was stealing in at the windows of the common sleeping room, when Nicholas, raising himself on his arm, looked among the prostrate forms which on every side surrounded him, as though in search of some particular object. It needed a quick eye to detect, from among the huddled mass of sleepers, the form of any given individual. As they lay closely packed together, covered, for warmth's sake, with their patched and ragged clothes, little could be distinguished but the sharp outlines of pale faces, over which the sombre light shed the same dull, heavy color, with here and there a gaunt arm thrust forth, its thinness hidden by no covering, but fully exposed to view in all its shrunken ugliness. There were some who, lying on their backs with upturned faces and clenched hands, just visible in the leaden light, bore more the aspect of dead bodies than of living creatures, and there were others, coiled up into strange and fantastic postures, such as might have been taken for the uneasy efforts of pain to gain some temporary relief, rather than the freaks of slumber. A few, and these were among the youngest of the children, slept peacefully on, with smiles upon their faces, dreaming, perhaps, of home. But ever and again a deep and heavy sigh, breaking the stillness of the room, announced that some new sleeper had awakened to the misery of another day. And as morning took the place of night, the smiles gradually faded away, with the friendly darkness which had given them birth. Dreams are the bright creatures of poem and legend, who sport on earth in the night season, and melt away in the first beam of the sun, which lights grim care and stern reality on their daily pilgrimage through the world. Nicholas looked upon the sleepers, at first with the air of one who gazes upon a scene which, though familiar to him, has lost none of its sorrowful effect and consequences, and afterwards with a more intense and searching scrutiny, as a man would who missed something his eye was accustomed to meet, and had expected to rest upon. He was still occupied in this search, and had half risen from his bed in the eagerness of his quest, when the voice of Squeers was heard, calling from the bottom of the stairs. "Now then," cried that gentleman, "are you going to sleep all day up there?" "You lazy hounds," added Mrs. Squeers, finishing the sentence, and producing at the same time a sharp sound, like that which is occasioned by the lacing of stays. "We shall be down directly, sir," replied Nicholas. "Down directly," said Squeers. "Ah, you'd better be down directly, or I'll be upon some of you in less. Where's that Smike?" Nicholas looked hurriedly round again, but made no answer. "Smike!" shouted Squeers. "Do you want your head broke in a fresh place, Smike?" demanded his amiable lady in the same key. Still there was no reply, and still Nicholas stared about him, as did the greater part of the boys, who were by this time roused. "Confound his impudence!" muttered Squeers, rapping the stair rail impatiently with his cane. "Nickleby!" "Well, sir?" "Send that obstinate scoundrel down. Don't you hear me calling?" "He's not here, sir," replied Nicholas. "Don't tell me a lie," retorted the schoolmaster. "He is." "He is not," retorted Nicholas angrily. "Don't tell me one." "We shall soon see that," said Mr. Squeers, rushing upstairs. "I'll find him, I warrant you." With which assurance Mr. Squeers bounced into the dormitory, and swinging his cane in the air ready for a blow, darted into the corner where the lean body of the drudge was usually stretched at night. The cane descended harmlessly upon the ground. There was nobody there. "What does this mean?" said Squeers, turning round with a very pale face. "Where have you hid him?" "I have seen nothing of him since last night," replied Nicholas. "Come," said Squeers, evidently frightened, though he endeavoured to look otherwise. "You won't save him this way. Where is he?" "At the bottom of the nearest pond, for aught I know," rejoined Nicholas in a low voice, and fixing his eyes full on the master's face. "Damn you, what do you mean by that?" retorted Squeers in great perturbation. Without waiting for a reply, he inquired of the boys whether any one among them knew anything of their missing schoolmate. There was a general hum of anxious denial, in the midst of which one shrill voice was heard to say, as indeed everybody thought, "Please, sir, I think Smike's run away, sir." "Ha!" cried Squeers, turning sharp round. "Who said that?" "Tompkins, please, sir," rejoined a chorus of voices. Mr. Squeers made a plunge into the crowd, and at one dive caught a very little boy, habited still in his night gear, and the perplexed expression of whose countenance, as he was brought forward, seemed to intimate that he was as yet uncertain whether he was about to be punished or rewarded for the suggestion. He was not long in doubt. "You think he has run away, do you, sir?" demanded Squeers. "Yes, please, sir," replied the little boy. "And what, sir," said Squeers, catching the little boy suddenly by the arms and whisking up his drapery in a most dexterous manner, "what reason have you to suppose that any boy would want to run away from this establishment? Eh, sir?" The child raised a dismal cry by way of answer, and Mr. Squeers, throwing himself into the most favourable attitude for exercising his strength, beat him until the little urchin in his writhings actually rolled out of his hands, when he mercifully allowed him to roll away as best he could. "There," said Squeers, Now, if any other boy thinks Smike has run away, I shall be glad to have a talk with him." There was, of course, a profound silence, during which Nicholas showed his disgust as plainly as looks could show it. "Well, Nickleby," said Squeers, eyeing him maliciously, "you think he has run away, I suppose?" "I think it extremely likely," replied Nicholas in a quiet manner. "Oh, you do you?" sneered Squeers. "Maybe you know he has." "I know nothing of the kind." "He didn't tell you he was going, I suppose, did he?" sneered Squeers. "He did not," replied Nicholas. I am very glad he did not, for it would then have been my duty to have warned you in time." "Which no doubt you would have been devilish sorry to do," said Squeers in a taunting fashion. "I should indeed," replied Nicholas. "You interpret my feelings with great accuracy." Mrs. Squeers had listened to this conversation from the bottom of the stairs, but now losing all patience, she hastily assumed her night jacket and made her way to the scene of the action. "What's all this here to do?" said the lady, as the boys fell off right and left to save her the trouble of clearing a passage with her brawny arms. "What on earth are you a-talking to him for, Squeery?" "Why, my dear," said Squeers, "the fact is that Smike is not to be found." "Well, I know that," said the lady, "and where's the wonder? If you get a parcel of proud-stomached teachers that set the young dogs a-rebelling, what else can you look for? Now, young man, you just have the kindness to take yourself off to the schoolroom, and take the boys off with you, and don't you stir out of there till you have leave given you, or you and I may fall out in a way that'll spoil your beauty, handsome as you think yourself, and so I tell you." "Indeed," said Nicholas. "Yes, and indeed again, Mr. Jackanapes," said the excited lady, "and I wouldn't keep such as you in the house another hour if I had my way." "Nor would you if I had mine," replied Nicholas. "Now, boys." "Ah, now, boys," said Mrs. Squeers, mimicking as nearly as she could the voice and manner of the usher. "Follow your leader, boys, and take pattern by Smike if you dare. See what he'll get for himself when he is brought back. And mind, I tell you that you shall have as bad, and twice as bad, if you so much as open your mouths about him." "If I catch him," said Squeers, "I'll only stop short of flaying him alive. I give you notice, boys." "If you catch him," retorted Miss Squeers contemptuously, "you are sure to. You can't help it if you go the right way to work. Come, away with you." And with these words, Mrs. Squeers dismissed the boys. And after a little light skirmishing with those in the rear, who were pressing forward to get out of the way, but were detained a few moments by the throng in front, succeeded in clearing the room, when she confronted her spouse alone. "He is off," said Mrs. Squeers. "The cow-house and stable are locked up, so he can't be there. And he's not downstairs anywhere, for the girl has looked. He must have gone York way, and by a public road, too." "Why must he?" inquired Squeers. "Stupid," said Miss Squeers angrily. "He hadn't any money, had he?" "Never had a penny of his own in his whole life, that I know of," replied Squeers. "To be sure," rejoined Mrs. Squeers. "And he didn't take anything to eat with him. That I'll answer for." "Ha, ha, ha!" "Ha, ha, ha!" laughed Squeers. "Then, of course," said Mrs. Squeers, "he must beg his way, and he could do that nowhere but on the public road." "That's true," exclaimed Squeers, clapping his hands. "True. Yes, but you would never have thought of that. For all that, if I hadn't said so," replied his wife. "Now, if you take the chase and go one road, and I borrow Swallow's chase and go the other, what with keeping our eyes open and asking questions, one or other of us is pretty certain to lay hold of him." The worthy lady's plan was adopted and put in execution without a moment's delay. After a very hasty breakfast, and the prosecution of some inquiries in the village, the result of which seemed to show that he was on the right track, Squeers started forth in the pony chase, intent upon discovery and vengeance. Shortly afterwards, Miss Squeers, arrayed in the white top-coat and tied up in various shawls and handkerchiefs, issued forth in another chase in another direction, taking with her a good-sized bludgeon, several odd pieces of strong cord, and a stout labouring man, all provided and carried upon the expedition, with the sole object of assisting in the capture, and once caught, ensuring the safe custody of the unfortunate Smike. Nicholas remained behind, in a tumult of feeling, sensible that whatever might be the upshot of the boy's flight, nothing but painful and deplorable consequences were likely to ensue from it. Death from wanton exposure to the weather was the best that could be expected from the protracted wanderings of so poor and helpless a creature, alone and unfriended, through a country of which he was wholly ignorant. There was little, perhaps, to choose between this fate and a return to the tender mercies of the Yorkshire school. But the unhappy being had established a hold upon his sympathy and compassion, which made his heart ache at the prospect of the suffering he was destined to undergo. He lingered on in restless anxiety, picturing 1,000 possibilities, until the evening of next day, when Squeers returned, alone and unsuccessful. Yep, root and branch. The whole family. No news of the scamp, said the schoolmaster, who had evidently been stretching his legs on the old principle not a few times during the journey. I'll have consolation for this out of somebody, Nickleby, if Miss Squeers don't hunt him down, so I give you warning. It is not in my power to console you, sir, said Nicholas. It is nothing to me. Isn't it? Said Squeers in a threatening manner. We shall see. We shall, rejoined Nicholas. Here's the pony run right off his legs, and me obliged to come home with a hack cob. That'll cost 15 shillings besides other expenses, said Squeers. Who's to pay for that, do you hear? Nicholas shrugged his shoulders and remained silent. I'll have it out of somebody, I tell you, said Squeers, his usual harsh, crafty manner changed to open bullying. None of your whining vaporings here, Mr. Puppy, but be off to your kennel, for it's past your bedtime. Come, get out. Nicholas bit his lip and knit his hands involuntarily, for his finger ends tingled to avenge the insult. But remembering that the man was drunk, and that it could come to little but a noisy brawl, he contented himself with darting a contemptuous look at the tyrant, and walked, as majestically as he could, upstairs. Not a little nettled, however, to observe that Miss Squeers and Master Squeers and the servant girl were enjoying the scene from a snug corner, the two former indulging in many edifying remarks about the presumption of poor upstarts, which occasioned a vast deal of laughter, in which even the most miserable of all miserable servant girls joined, while Nicholas, stung to the quick, drew over his head such bedclothes as he had, and sternly resolved that the outstanding account between himself and Mr. Squeers should be settled rather more speedily than the latter anticipated. Quit resolving and do something, Nicholas. Sheesh. Another day came, and Nicholas was scarcely awake when he heard the wheels of a chaise approaching the house. It stopped. The voice of Miss Squeers was heard, and in exultation ordering a glass of spirits for somebody, which was in itself a sufficient sign that something extraordinary had happened. Nicholas hardly dared to look out the window, but he did so, and the very first object that met his eyes was the wretched Smike, so bedabbled with mud and rain, so haggard and worn and wild, that, but for his garments being such as no scarecrow was ever seen to wear, he might have been doubtful, even then, of his identity. Lift him out, said Squeers, after he had literally feasted his eyes in silence upon the culprit. Bring him in. Bring him in. Take care, cried Miss Squeers, as her husband proffered his assistance. We tied his legs under the apron and made him fast to the chaise to prevent his giving us the slip again. With hands trembling with delight, Squeers unloosened the cord, and Smike, to all appearance more dead than alive, was brought into the house and securely locked up in a cellar, until such time as Mr. Squeers should deem it expedient to operate upon him in presence of the assembled school. Upon a hasty consideration of the circumstances, it may be matter of surprise to some persons that Mr. and Mrs. Squeers should have taken so much trouble to repossess themselves of an encumbrance of which it was their wont to complain so loudly. But their surprise will cease when they are informed that the manifold services of the drudge, if performed by anybody else, would have cost the establishment some 10 or 12 shillings per week in the shape of wages, and furthermore that all runaways were, as a matter of policy, made severe examples of at Dotheboys Hall, inasmuch as, in consequence of the limited extent of its attractions, there was but little inducement beyond the powerful impulse of fear for any pupil, provided with the usual number of legs and the power of using them, to remain. The news that Smike had been caught and brought back in triumph ran like wildfire through the hungry community, and expectation was on tiptoe all morning. On tiptoe it was destined to remain, however, until afternoon, when Squeers, having refreshed himself with his dinner, and further strengthened himself by an extra libation or so, made his appearance, accompanied by his amiable partner, with a countenance of portentous import, and a fearful instrument of flagellation. Strong, supple, wax-ended, and new, in short, purchased that morning, expressly for the occasion. So he's going to horsewhip him. "Is every boy here?" asked Squeers, in a tremendous voice. Every boy was there, but every boy was afraid to speak, so Squeers glared along the lines to assure himself, and every eye drooped, and every head cowered down as he did so. "Each boy keep his place," said Squeers, administering his favorite blow to the desk, and regarding with gloomy satisfaction the universal start which it never failed to occasion. "Nickleby, to your desk, sir." It was remarked by more than one small observer that there was a very curious and unusual expression in the usher's face, but he took his seat without opening his lips in reply. Squeers, casting a triumphant glance at his assistant, and a look of most comprehensive despotism on the boys, left the room, and shortly afterwards returned, dragging Smike by the collar, or rather by that fragment of his jacket which was nearest the place where his collar would have been had he boasted such a decoration. In any other place, the appearance of the wretched, jaded, spiritless object would have occasioned a murmur of compassion and remonstrance. It had some effect even there, for the lookers-on moved unsteadily or uneasily in their seats, and a few of the boldest ventured to steal looks at each other, expressive of indignation and pity. They were lost on Squeers, however, whose gaze was fastened on the luckless Smike, as he inquired, according to custom in such cases, whether he had anything to say for himself. "Nothing, I suppose," said Squeers, with a diabolical grin. Smike glanced round, and his eye rested for an instant on Nicholas, as if he had expected him to intercede, but his look was riveted on his desk. "Have you anything to say?" demanded Squeers again, giving his right arm 2 or 3 flourishes to try its power and suppleness. "Stand a little out of the way, Mrs. Squeers, my dear. I've hardly got room enough." "Spare me, sir," cried Smike. "Oh, that's all, is it?" said Squeers. "Yes, I'll flog you with an inch of your life, and spare you that." "Ha, ha, ha, ha," laughed Mrs. Squeers. "That's a good 'un." "I was driven to it," said Smike faintly, and casting another imploring look about him. "Driven to do it, were you?" said Squeers. "Oh, it wasn't your fault. It was mine, I suppose, eh?" "A nasty, ungrateful, pig-headed, brutish, obstinate, sneaking dog!" exclaimed Mrs. Squeers, taking Smike's head under her arm and administering a cuff at every epithet. "What does he mean by that?" I want to reach into the book and punch these people. "Stand aside, my dear," replied Squeers. "We'll try and find out." Mrs. Squeers, being out of breath with her exertions, complied. Squeers caught the boy firmly in his grip. One desperate cut had fallen on his body. He was wincing from the lash and uttering a scream of pain. It was raised again, and again about to fall, when Nicholas Nickleby, suddenly starting up, cried, "Stop!" in a voice that made the rafters ring. "Who cried stop?" said Squeers, turning savagely round. "I," said Nicholas, stepping forward. "This must not go on." "Must not go on?" cried Squeers, almost in a shriek. "Kick his ass, Nicholas." "No," thundered Nicholas. Aghast and stupefied by the boldness of the interference, Squeers released his hold of Smike, and falling back a pace or two, gazed upon Nicholas with looks that were positively frightful. "I say must not," repeated Nicholas, nothing daunted. "Shall not. I will prevent it." Squeers continued to gaze upon him, with his eyes starting out of his head, but astonishment had actually, for the moment, bereft him of speech. "You have disregarded all my quiet interference in the miserable lad's behalf," said Nicholas. "You have returned no answer to the letter in which I begged forgiveness for him, and offered to be responsible that he would remain quietly here. Don't blame me for this public interference. You have brought it upon yourself, not I." "Sit down, beggar!" screamed Squeers, almost beside himself with rage, and seizing Smike as he spoke. "Wretch!" rejoined Nicholas fiercely. "Touch him at your peril. I will not stand by and see it done. My blood is up, and I have the strength of 10 such men as you. Look to yourself, for by heaven I will not spare you if you drive me on." "Stand back!" cried Squeers, brandishing his weapon. "I have a long series of insults to avenge," said Nicholas, flushed with passion, "and my indignation is aggravated by the dastardly cruelties practiced on helpless infancy in this foul den. Have a care, for if you do raise the devil within me, the consequences shall fall heavily upon your own head." He had scarcely spoken when Squeers, in a violent outbreak of wrath, and with a cry like a howl of a wild beast, spat upon him and struck him a blow across the face with his instrument of torture, which raised up a bar of livid flesh as it was inflicted. Smarting with the agony of the blow, and concentrating into that one moment all his feelings of rage, scorn, and indignation, Nicholas sprang upon him, wrested the weapon from his hand, and pinning him by the throat, beat the ruffian till he roared for mercy. The boys, with the exception of Master Squeers, who, coming to his father's assistance, harassed the enemy in the rear, moved not, hand or foot. But Mrs. Squeers, with many shrieks for aid, hung on to the tail of her partner's coat, and endeavored to drag him from his infuriated adversary, while Miss Squeers, who had been peeping through the keyhole in expectation of a very different scene, darted in at the very beginning of the attack, and after launching a shower of inkstands at the usher's head, beat Nicholas to her heart's content, animating herself at every blow with the recollection of his having refused her proffered love, and thus imparting additional strength to an arm which, as she took after her mother in this respect, was at no time one of the weakest. Nicholas, in the full torrent of his violence, felt the blows no more than if they had been dealt with feathers, but, becoming tired of the noise and uproar, and feeling that his arm grew weak besides, he threw all his remaining strength into a half-dozen finishing cuts, and flung Squeers from him with all the force he could muster. The violence of his fall precipitated Mrs. Squeers completely over an adjacent form, and Squeers, striking his head against it in his descent, lay at his full length on the ground, stunned and motionless. Having brought affairs to this happy termination, and ascertained to his thorough satisfaction that Squeers was not only stunned and not dead, upon which point he had had some unpleasant doubts at first, Nicholas left his family to restore him, and retired to consider what course he had better adopt. He looked anxiously around for Smike as he left the room, but he was nowhere to be seen. After a brief consideration, he packed up a few clothes in a small leather valise, and finding that nobody offered to oppose his progress, marched boldly out by the front door, and shortly afterwards struck into the road which led to Greta Bridge. When he had cooled sufficiently to be enabled to give his present circumstances some little reflection, they did not appear in a very encouraging light. He had only 4 shillings and a few pence in his pocket, and was something more than 250 miles from London, whither he resolved to direct his steps, that he might ascertain, among other things, what account of the morning's proceedings Mr. Squeers transmitted to his most affectionate uncle. Lifting up his eyes as he arrived at the conclusion that there was no remedy for this unfortunate state of things, he beheld a horseman coming towards him, whom, on nearer approach, he discovered to his infinite chagrin to be no other than Mr. John Browdy, who, clad in cords and leather leggings, was urging his animal forward by means of a thick ash stick, which seemed to have been recently cut from some stout sapling. "I am in no mood for more noise and riot," thought Nicholas, "and yet, do what I will, I shall have an altercation with this honest blockhead, and perhaps a blow or two from yonder staff." In truth, there appeared some reason to expect that such a result would follow from the encounter, for John Browdy no sooner saw Nicholas advancing than he reined in his horse by the footpath, and waited until such time as he should come up, looking meanwhile very sternly between the horse's ears at Nicholas as he came on at his leisure. "Servant, young gentleman," said John. "Yours," said Nicholas. "Weel, we have met at last," observed John, making the stirrup ring under a smart touch of his ash stick. "Yes," replied Nicholas, hesitating. "Come," he said, frankly, after a moment's pause. "We parted on no very good terms the last time we met. It was my fault, I believe, but I had no intention of offending you, and no idea that I was doing so. I was very sorry for it afterwards. Will you shake hands?" "Shake hands!" cried the good-humoured Yorkshireman. "Ah, that I will." At the same time, he bent down from the saddle and gave Nicholas's fist a huge wrench. "But what be the matter with the feast, mun? It all broken like." "It is a cut," said Nicholas, turning scarlet as he spoke. "A blow, but I returned it to the giver, and with good interest too." "No, did he though?" exclaimed John Brody. "Well, Dean, I like un for that." "The fact is," said Nicholas, not very well knowing how to make the avowal, "the fact is that I have been ill-treated." "Now," interposed John Brody, in a tone of compassion, for he was a giant in strength and stature, and Nicholas, very likely in his eyes, seemed a mere dwarf. "Don't say that." "Yes, I have," replied Nicholas, "by that man Squeers, and I have beaten him soundly, and am leaving this place in consequence." "What?" cried John Brody, with such an ecstatic shout that the horse quite shied at it. "Beaten the schoolmeaster! Ha, 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 beaten the schoolmeaster! Who ever heard of the like on that new? Give us thine hond again, youngster! Beaten the schoolmeaster! Dang it, I love thee for it!" With these expressions of delight, John Brody laughed and laughed again, so loud that the echoes, far and wide, sent back nothing but jovial peals of merriment, and shook Nicholas by the hand meanwhile, no less heartily. When his mirth had subsided, he inquired what Nicholas meant to do. On his informing him to go straight to London, he shook his head doubtfully, and inquired if he knew how much the coaches charged to carry passengers so far. "No, I do not," said Nicholas, "but it is of no great consequence to me, for I intend walking." "Oh, hey, Artie Taylor, I am so sorry I missed the subscription. I need to fix the notifications. I am not getting them properly." Although I think that was on YouTube, actually. So I don't know if you're in the feed here or not. "No, I do not," said Nicholas, "but it is of no great consequence to me, for I intend walking. Hello, little dude." "Gang away to Lunan afoot?" cried John in amazement. "Every step of the way," replied Nicholas. "I should be many steps further on by this time, and so goodbye." "Nay, no," replied the honest countryman, reining in his impatient horse. "Stand still, Telly. How much cash has thee gotten?" "Not much," said Nicholas, colouring, "but I can make it enough. Where there's a will, there's a way, you know." John Brody made no verbal answer to this remark, but putting his hand in his pocket, pulled out an old purse of solid leather, and insisted that Nicholas should borrow from him whatever he required for his present necessities. "Don't be afraid, mun. Take enough to carry thee home. Thee'll pay me on one day, I warrant." Nicholas could by no means be prevailed upon to borrow more than a sovereign, with which loan Mr. Brody, after many entreaties that he would accept of more, observing with a touch of Yorkshire caution that if he didn't spend it all he could put the surplus by till he had an opportunity of remitting it carriage-free, was fain to content himself. "Take that bit of timber to help thee on with, mun," he added, pressing his stick on Nicholas, and giving his hand another squeeze. "Keep a good heart and bless thee. Beatin' the schoolmeaster. Cod, it's the best thing I've heard this whole 20 year." So saying and indulging, with more delicacy than might have been expected from him, in another series of loud laughs, for the purpose of avoiding the thanks which Nicholas poured forth, John Brody set spurs to his horse, and went off at a smart canter, looking back from time to time, as Nicholas stood gazing after him, and waving his hand cheerily, as if to encourage him on his way. Nicholas watched the horse and rider until they disappeared over the brow of a distant hill, and then set forward on his journey. He did not travel far that afternoon, for by this time it was nearly dark, and there had been a heavy fall of snow, which not only rendered the way toilsome, but the track uncertain and difficult to find after daylight, save by experienced wayfarers. He lay that night at a cottage, where beds were let at a cheap rate to the more humble class of travellers, and rising betimes next morning, he made his way before night to Boroughbridge. Passing through that town in search of some cheap resting place, he stumbled upon an empty barn within a couple of 100 yards of the roadside, in a warm corner of which he stretched his weary limbs and soon fell asleep. When he awoke next morning and tried to recollect his dreams, which had been all connected with his recent sojourn at Dotheboys Hall, he sat up, rubbed his eyes, and stared, not with the most composed countenance possible, at some motionless object which seemed to be stationed within a few yards in front of him. "Strange," cried Nicholas. "Can this be some lingering creation of the visions that have scarcely left me? It cannot be real, and yet I am awake. Smike!" The form moved, rose, advanced, and dropped upon its knees at his feet. It was Smike, indeed. "Why do you kneel to me?" said Nicholas, hastily raising him. "To go with you, anywhere, everywhere, to the world's end, to the churchyard grave," replied Smike, clinging to his hand. "Let me, oh, do let me. You're my home, my kind friend. Take me with you, pray." "I'm a friend who can do little for you," said Nicholas kindly. "How came you here?" He had followed him, it seemed, had never lost sight of him all the way, had watched while he slept, and when he halted for refreshment, and had feared to appear before, lest he should be sent back. He had not intended to appear now, but Nicholas had awakened more suddenly than he looked for, and he had had no time to conceal himself. "Poor fellow," said Nicholas, "your hard fate denies you any friend but one, and he is nearly as poor and helpless as yourself." May I go with you?" asked Smike timidly. "I'll be your faithful, hard-working servant. I will indeed. I want no clothes," added the poor creature, drawing his rags together. "These will do very well. I only want to be near you." "And you shall," cried Nicholas, "and the world shall deal by you as it does by me, till one or both of us shall quit it for a better. Come." With these words he strapped his burden on his shoulders, and taking his stick in one hand, extended the other to his delighted charge, and so they passed out of the old barn together. Aww. It's pretty sweet. All right, let's take a short intermission, and then we'll get on with chapter 14. And thank God we don't have to deal with him living at Dotheboys Hall anymore. Yes, it is absolutely time to refresh my tea. 100%. And I definitely need to pick up that tea warmer. Hey, J-Math, I'm glad you could make the stream. There are decaffeinated teas. You could have some chamomile, would actually be really nice to drink and listen to story time with. It's all right. I'm just glad you're here. Hey, Megster. How was your stream today, Meg? By the way, if any of you like House Flipper or is it Dead by Daylight or Dead by Dawn? If I can do my commands right. Go check out Megsters. You know what I wish? I wish I had some of my grandmother's Spritz cookies. Oh, that's right. It was going to be your cosplay stream. What'd you end up cosplaying as? I'm going to have to check the recording so I can see the costume. My grandmother used to make these amazing spritz cookies that were awesome with tea. Or with coffee, for those who drink coffee, but I've never been a coffee person, to be honest. Something about it just never tasted right. Which was a bit odd in the military because everybody drank coffee in the military. When I got to my first command and they found out that I hated coffee, they put me in charge of making coffee for everybody. Not that that was like my only duty or anything, just that I had to do that in addition to everything else. I did get in trouble once. You you might appreciate this. The smell's not great, but it's mostly the flavor, or things that have like a coffee flavor to them, like Kahlua, for example. I can't abide Kahlua. So I was cleaning up the coffee mess, and there was one mug that was particularly stained and had a lot of residue on it, and I cleaned it. And I got in so much trouble for cleaning that coffee cup. Apparently, the individual would rely on all that accumulated detritus, and when he didn't have time or there wasn't coffee around, would pour hot water into it. Yeah, apparently it also flavored it too. Yep, it was a thing. Did you ever run into anybody that did it when you were in the military, Vela? No. Yeah, the only cleaning it got was the incredibly hot water that got put into it, which killed everything, I guess. Yeah, basically that. So that's kind of cool, though. The notificate or the subscriptions get notified now for YouTube on Streamlabs. It's awesome. By the way, if you're listening and you haven't gone over to the YouTube, do go over there, hit that subscribe button, get access to all the old content and the archives. So if you make it late to a stream or whatnot, you can catch up on the story if you want to. Yep, that's basically how he did it, Vela. It sat on the control console, and unless there was something growing in it, you didn't touch it. The weirdest thing about the coffee was they had me add salt to it, which possibly was as much because we were dealing with a maybe that it may have also had to do with the nature of the water that we drank. Um, it was a recycled water system, so yes, it got reprocessed. Like I said, I don't know much about coffee. I followed the instructions I was given and tried not to get into too much trouble. Apparently, any lack of ability in coffee making that I had was offset by the enjoyment of making me do it. So, all right. Did everybody have a chance to refill their mugs, take a break, whatever they needed to do. And there's the last of the Darjeeling. There's only so much Darjeeling. The Darjeeling is limited. It's got to be a yes or no question, Meg. That's all it works with. Hey, Plague, glad to see you. Well, you could try to narrow it down, like is obvious over 20 years old. Yeah, see? There you go. So Plague, type exclamation mark, the number 8, and then ball, and then ask your question after a space. It has to be a yes or no question. So probably not ancient as fuck. Or, shoot. Probably not ancient, Panda. All right. There's no 8 ball on the main screen, so if you want to ask real quick, do it now. And then I'm going to switch us back over to the Sisyphus. Anybody? Anybody? Plague, I might be willing to play Phasmo with subscribers. Maybe. Probably. It did look like a cool game. That's the ghost hunting one, right? Yep. I'm a cheap date. Couple bucks. The subscriptions are over on Patreon if you do want to do that. Tier 1 is $3, tier 2 is $6, and all but a small processing fee to Patreon. Um, it's not even that. I charge less than Twitch. But only go over there if you want to support the stream. It is not a requirement. You guys are welcome to come and listen to Storytime for years if you'd like to, without subscribing. But the more people do support the stream, the more I can do things like pick up a random game to play with you guys, or you know, get a stream deck, or if I can find a better internet company, a better internet tier, so that we don't have to deal with frame drops and that kind of thing. I've already made some improvements to the stream from the people who've supported already, which is why you guys get pretty transitions and a view of Mount Fuji and stuff like that. Meg, I'll play it on Discord and stream it. I tell you what, there's 11 people in here. I've got 5 subscribers, so what? 3 new subscriptions, tier 1 or better, and I'll buy Phasmo and play it after the stream. And I'll stream it in the I'll share the screen on Discord for you guys if you want to watch. How about that? Is that a deal? That means only half the people in here who haven't subscribed have to do anything. And I'm pretty sure that Phasmo costs more money than I would get from that. So it's not like I'm making money on the deal either. Yeah, hit up that Patreon link. I see 3 new ones before the end of the stream. I'll go buy Phasmo and we'll play it after the stream. Deal? Oh, and do join the Discord. But let's get back to the book. We've got about 40 minutes left to read. Let me throw up a goal real quick. All right, there you guys go. I just threw in a random date, but it's by the end of the stream. So I'll check Patreon at the end of the stream. If I see 8 subscribers instead of 5, I'll buy Phasmo. We'll play it after the stream. And I'll stream it in Discord for anybody that wants to watch. But let's return to the story. Chapter 14. Having the misfortune to treat of none but common people, it is necessarily of a mean and vulgar character. In that quarter of London in which the Golden Square is situated, there is a bygone, faded, tumble-down street, with 2 irregular rows of tall, meagre houses, which seems to have stared each other out of countenance years ago. The very chimneys appear to have grown dismal and melancholy, from having had nothing better to look at than the chimneys over the way. Their tops are battered and broken and blackened with smoke, and here and there some taller stack than the rest, inclining heavily to one side, and toppling over the roof, seems to meditate taking revenge for half a century's neglect, by crushing the inhabitants of the garrets beneath. The fowls who peck about the kennels, jerking their bodies hither and thither with a gait which none but town fowls are ever seen to adopt, and which any country cock or hen would be puzzled to understand, are perfectly in keeping with the crazy habitations of their owners. Dingy, ill-plumed, drowsy flutterers sent, like many of the neighboring children, to get a livelihood in the streets, they hop from stone to stone in forlorn search of some hidden eatable in the mud, and can scarcely raise a crow among them. The only one with anything approaching to a voice is an aged bantam at the baker's, and even he is hoarse in consequence of bad living in his last place. To judge from the size of the houses, they have been, at one time, tenanted by persons of better condition than their present occupants, but they are now let off by the week in floors or rooms, and every door has almost as many plates or bell handles as there are apartments within. The windows are, for the same reason, sufficiently diversified in appearance, being ornamented with every variety of common blind and curtain that can easily be imagined, while every doorway is blocked up and rendered nearly impassable by a motley collection of children and porter pots of all sizes, from the baby in arms and the half-pint pot to the full-grown girl in half-gallon can. In the parlor of one of these houses, which was perhaps a thought dirtier than any of its neighbors, which exhibited more bell handles, children, and porter pots, and caught in all its freshness the first gust of the thick black smoke that poured forth night and day from a large brewery hard by, hung a bill, announcing that there was yet one room to let within its walls, though on what story the vacant room could be, regard being had to the outward tokens of many lodgers which the whole front displayed, from the mangle in the kitchen window to the flower pots in the parapet. It would have been beyond the power of a calculating boy to discover. The common stairs of this mansion were bare and carpetless, but a curious visitor who had to climb his way to the top might have observed that there were not wanting indications of the progressive poverty of the inmates, although their rooms were shut. Thus, the first-floor lodgers, being flush of furniture, kept an old mahogany table, real mahogany, on the landing place outside, which was only taken in when occasion required. On the second story, the spare furniture dwindled down to a couple of old deal chairs, of which one, belonging to the back room, was shorn of a leg and bottomless. The story above boasted no greater excess than a worm-eaten washtub, and the garret landing place displayed no costlier articles than 2 crippled pitchers and some broken blacking bottles. It was on this garret landing place that a hard-featured, square-faced man, elderly and shabby, stopped to unlock the door of the front attic, into which, having surmounted the task of turning the rusty key in its still more rusty wards, he walked with the air of legal owner. This person wore a wig of short, coarse red hair, which he took off with his hat and hung upon a nail. Having adopted in its place a dirty cotton nightcap, and groped about in the dark till he found a remnant of a candle, he knocked at the partition which divided the 2 garrets, and inquired in a loud voice whether Mr. Noggs had a light. So this awful place is where Noggs lives, huh? Okay. The sounds that came back were stifled by the lath and plaster, and it seemed, moreover, as though the speaker had uttered them from the interior of a mug or other drinking vessel. But they were in the voice of Newman, and conveyed a reply in the affirmative. "A nasty night, Mr. Noggs," said the man in the nightcap, stepping in to light his candle. "Does it rain?" asked Newman. "Does it?" replied the other pettishly. "I am wet through." "It doesn't take much to wet you and me through, Mr. Crowell," said Newman, laying his hand upon the lapel of his threadbare coat. "Well, and that makes it the more vexatious," observed Mr. Crowell in the same pettish tone. Uttering a low, querulous growl, the speaker, whose harsh countenance was the very epitome of selfishness, raked the scanty fire nearly out of the grate, and emptying the glass which Noggs had pushed towards him, inquired where he kept his coals. Newman Noggs pointed to the bottom of a cupboard, and Mr. Crowell, seizing the shovel, threw on half the stock, which Noggs very deliberately took off again, without saying a word. "You have not turned saving at this time of day, I hope," said Crowell. Newman pointed to the empty glass, as though it were a sufficient refutation of the charge, and briefly said that he was going downstairs to supper. "To the Kinwiggses?" asked Crowell. Newman nodded assent. "Think of that now," said Crowell. "If I didn't, thinking that you were certain not to go, because you said you wouldn't, tell Kinwiggs I couldn't come, and make up my mind to spend the evening with you." "I was obliged to go," said Newman. "They would have me." "Well, what's to become of me?" urged the selfish man, who never thought of anybody else. "It's all your fault. I'll tell you what, I'll sit by your fire till you come back again." Newman cast a despairing glance at his small store of fuel, but, not having the courage to say no, a word which in all his life he had never said at the right time, either to himself or to anyone else, gave way to the proposed arrangement. The lodgers to whom Crowell had made allusions under the designation of the Kinwiggses were the wife and olive branches of one Mr. Kinwiggs, a turner in ivory, who was looked upon as a person of some consideration on the premises, inasmuch as he occupied the whole of the first floor, comprising a suite of 2 rooms. Mrs. Kinwiggs, too, was quite a lady in her manners, and of a very genteel family, having an uncle who collected a water rate, Besides which distinction, the two eldest of her little girls went twice a week to a dancing school in the neighborhood, and had flaxen hair tied with blue ribbons hanging in luxuriant pigtails down their backs, and wore little white trousers with frills round the ankles. For all of which reasons, and many more equally valid but too numerous to mention, Mrs. Kenwigs was considered a very desirable person to know, and was the constant theme of all the gossips in the street, and even 3 or 4 doors round the corner at both ends. It was the anniversary of that happy day on which the Church of England, as by law established, had bestowed Mrs. Kenwigs upon Mr. Kenwigs, and in grateful commemoration of the same, Mrs. Kenwigs had invited a few select friends to cards and a supper in the first floor, and had put on a new gown to receive them, which gown, being of a flaming color and made upon a juvenile principle, was so successful that Mr. Kenwigs said the 8 years of matrimony and the 5 children seemed all a dream, and Mrs. Kenwigs younger and more blooming than on the very first Sunday he had kept company with her. Beautiful as Mrs. Kenwigs looked when she dressed, though, and so stately that you would have supposed she had a cook and housemaid at the least, and nothing to do but order them about. She had a world of trouble with the preparations, more indeed than she, being of a delicate and genteel constitution, could have sustained, had not the pride of housewifery upheld her. At last, however, all the things that had to be got together were got together, and all the things that had to be got out of the way were got out of the way, and everything was ready, and the collector himself having promised to come, fortune smiled upon the occasion. I can definitely sympathize with her. Prior to the year of the pandemic, I hosted the family holidays for all the holidays of the year. And as much as I do enjoy it, it is quite the trial and tribulation getting everything ready and cooked and prepped and ordered and everything else. The party was admirably selected. There were, first of all, Mr. Kenwigs and Mrs. Kenwigs, and 4 Olive Kenwigses, who sat up to supper firstly, because it was but right that they should have a treat on such a day, and secondly, because their going to bed, in presence of the company, would have been inconvenient, not to say improper. Then there was a young lady who had made Mrs. Kenwig's dress, and who, it was the most convenient thing in the world, living in the 2-pair back, gave up her bed to the baby, and got a little girl to watch it. Then to match this young lady was a young man who had known Mr. Kenwigs when he was a bachelor, and was much esteemed by the ladies as bearing the reputation of a rake. To these were added a newly married couple, who had visited Mr. and Mrs. Kenwigs in their courtship, and a sister of Mrs. Kenwigs, who was quite a beauty, besides whom there was another young man, supposed to entertain honourable designs upon the lady last mentioned, and Mr. Noggs, who was a genteel person to ask, because he had been a gentleman once. There were also an elderly lady from the back parlour, and one more young lady, who next to the collector, perhaps was the great lion of the party, being the daughter of a theatrical fireman who went on in the pantomime, and had the greatest turn for the stage that was ever known, being able to sing and recite in a manner that brought the tears into Mrs. Kenwig's eyes. There was only one drawback upon the pleasure of seeing such friends, and that was that the lady in the back parlour, who was very fat and turned of 60, came in a low book muslin dress and short kid gloves, which so exasperated Mrs. Kenwigs that lady assured her visitors in private that if it hadn't happened that the supper was cooking at the back parlour grate at that moment, she certainly would have requested its representative to withdraw. "My dear," said Mr. Kenwigs, "wouldn't it be better to begin a round game?" "Kenwigs, my dear," returned his wife, "I am surprised at you. Would you begin without my uncle?" "I forgot the collector," said Kenwigs. "Oh, no, that would never do." "He's so particular," said Mrs. Kenwigs, turning to the other married lady, "that if we began without him, I should be out of his will for ever." "Dear!" cried the married lady. "You've no idea what he is," replied Mrs. Kenwigs, "and yet as good a creature as ever breathed." "The kindest-hearted man as ever was," said Kenwigs. "It goes to his heart, I believe, to be forced to cut the water off when the people don't pay," observed the bachelor friend, intending a joke. "George," said Mr. Kenwigs, solemnly, "none of that, if you please." "It was only my joke," said the friend, abashed. George, rejoined Mr. Kenwigs, a joke is a very good thing, but when that joke is made at the expense of Mrs. Kenwigs's feelings, I set my face against it. A man in public life expects to be sneered at. It is the fault of his elevated situation, and not of himself. Mrs. Kenwigs's relation is a public man, and that he knows, George, and that he can bear. But putting Mrs. Kenwigs out of the question, if I could put Mrs. Kenwigs out of the question on such an occasion as this, I have the honor to be connected with the collector by marriage, and I cannot allow these remarks in my— Kenwigs was going to say house, but he rounded the sentence with apartments. At the conclusion of these observations, which drew forth evidences of acute feeling from Mrs. Kenwigs, and had the intended effect of impressing the company with a deep sense of the collector's dignity, a ring was heard at the bell. "That's him," whispered Mr. Kenwigs, greatly excited. "Morlena, my dear, run down and let your uncle in, and kiss him directly you get the door open. Let's be talking." Adopting Mr. Kenwigs' suggestion, the company spoke very loudly to look easy and unembarrassed, and almost as soon as they had begun to do so, a short old gentleman in drabs and gaiters, with a face that might have been carved out of lignum vitae for anything that appeared to the contrary, was led playfully in by Miss Morlena Kenwigs, regarding whose uncommon Christian name it may be here remarked that it had been invented and composed by Mrs. Kenwigs previous to her first lying in, for the special distinction of her eldest child, in case it should prove a daughter. "Oh, uncle, I am so glad to see you," said Mrs. Kenwigs, kissing the collector affectionately on both cheeks. "So glad." "Many happy returns on the day, my dear," replied the collector, returning the compliment. Now this was an interesting thing. Here was a collector of water rates, without his book, without his pen and ink, without his double knock, without his intimidation, actually kissing an agreeable female, and leaving taxes, summonses, notices that he had called, or announcements that he would never call again, for 2 quarters due, wholly out of the question. It was pleasant to see how the company looked on, quite absorbed in the sight, and to behold the nods and winks with which they expressed their gratification at finding so much humanity in a tax-gatherer. "Where will you sit, uncle?" said Mrs. Kenwigs, in the full glow of family pride, which the appearance of her distinguished relation occasioned. "Anywheres, my dear," said the collector. "I am not particular." "Not particular? What a meek collector! If he had been an author who knew his place, he couldn't have been more humble." "Mr. Lillyvick," said Kenwigs, addressing the collector, "some friends here, sir, are very anxious for the honor of— Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Cutler, Mr. Lillyvick." "Proud to know you, sir," said Mr. Cutler. "I've heard of you very often." These were not mere words of ceremony, for Mr. Cutler, having kept house in Mr. Lillyvick's parish, had heard of him very often indeed. His attention in calling had been quite extraordinary. "George, you know, I think, Mr. Lillyvick," said Kenwigs. "Lady from downstairs, Mr. Lillyvick. Mr. Snooks, Mr. Lillyvick. Miss Green, Mr. Lillyvick. Mr. Lillyvick, Miss Pitoker of the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane. Very glad to make 2 public characters acquainted. Mrs. Kenwigs, my dear, will you sort the counters?" Mrs. Kenwigs, with the assistance of Newman Noggs, who, as he had performed sundry little acts of kindness for the children, at all times and seasons, was humoured in his request to be taken no notice of, and was merely spoken about in a whisper as the decayed gentleman, did as he was desired, and the greater part of the guests sat down to speculation, while Newman himself, Mrs. Kenwigs, and Miss Pitoker of the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, looked after the supper table. While the ladies were thus busying themselves, Mr. Lillyvick was intent upon the game in progress, and as all should be fish that comes to a water collector's net, the dear old gentleman was by no means scrupulous in appropriating to himself the property of his neighbours, which on the contrary he abstracted whenever an opportunity presented itself, smiling good-humouredly all the while making so many condescending speeches to the owners that they were delighted with his amiability, and thought in their hearts that he deserved to be the Chancellor of the Exchequer at least. After a great deal of trouble, and the administration of many slaps on the head to the infant Kenwigses, whereof 2 of the most rebellious were summarily banished, the cloth was laid with much elegance, and a pair of boiled fowls, a large piece of pork, apple pie, potatoes, and greens were served, at sight of which The worthy Mr. Lillyvick vented a great many witticisms, and plucked up amazingly, to the immense delight and satisfaction of the whole body of admirers. Very well and very fast the supper went off, no more serious difficulties occurring than those which arose from the incessant demand for clean knives and forks. Hey, we've gotten one of the new subscribers. Good night, Meg. We got 2 more, and it's Phasmo night. Which made Mrs. Kenwig's wish, more than once, that private society adopted the principle of schools, and required that every guest should bring his own knife, fork, and spoon, which doubtless would be a great accommodation in many cases, and to no one more so than to the lady and gentleman of the house, especially if the school principle were carried out to the full extent, and the articles were expected, as a matter of delicacy, not to be taken away again. What's our oof? Updating the sub goals since it's not integrated with Patreon yet, because I can't figure out how to get it to do it. Ignore you? How am I ignoring you? There we go. Updated. No worries. I was just updating the goal real quick. Everybody having eaten everything, the table was cleared in a most alarming hurry, and with great noise, and the spirits, whereat the eyes of Newman Noggs glistened, being arranged in order, with water both hot and cold, the party composed themselves for conviviality, Mr. Lillyvick being stationed in a large armchair by the fireside, and the 4 little Kinswiggses disposed on a small form in front of the company, with their flaxen tails toward them, and their faces to the fire. An arrangement which was no sooner perfected than Mrs. Kenwigs was overpowered by the feelings of a mother, and fell upon the left shoulder of Mr. Kenwigs, dissolved in tears. "They are so beautiful," said Mrs. Kenwigs, sobbing. Good night, Meg. I'm glad you made it for a bit. "Oh dear," said all the ladies, "so they are. It is very natural you should feel proud of that. But don't give way, don't." I cannot help it, and it don't signify," sobbed Mrs. Kenwigs. "Oh, they're too beautiful to live, much too beautiful." On hearing this alarming presentiment of their being doomed to an early death in the flower of their infancy, all 4 little girls raised a hideous cry, and burying their heads in their mother's lap, simultaneously screamed until the 8 flaxen tails vibrated again. Mrs. Kenwigs, meanwhile, clasping them alternately to her bosom, with attitudes expressive of distraction, which Miss Petowker herself might have copied. At length, the anxious mother permitted herself to be soothed into a more tranquil state, and the little Kinswigses, being also composed, were distributed among the company to prevent the possibility of Mrs. Kenwigs being again overcome by the blaze of their combined beauty. This done, the ladies and gentlemen united in prophesying that they would live for many, many years, and that there was no occasion at all for Miss Kenwigs to distress herself, which in good truth there did not appear to be, the loveliness of the children by no means justifying her apprehensions. "This day 8 years," said Mr. Kenwigs after a pause. "Dear me, ah!" This reflection was echoed by all present, who said "ah" first and "dear me" afterward. "I was younger then," tittered Mrs. Kenwigs. "No," said the collector. "Certainly not," added everybody. "I remember my niece," said Mr. Lillyvick, surveying his audience with a grave air. "I remember her on that very afternoon when she first acknowledged to her mother a partiality for Kenwigs. 'Mother,' she says, 'I love him.' Adore him, I said, uncle, interposed Mrs. Kenwigs. Love him, I think, my dear, said the collector firmly. Perhaps you are right, uncle, replied Mrs. Kenwigs submissively. I thought it was adore. Love, my dear, retorted Mr. Lillyvick. Mother, she says, I love him. What do I hear? Cries her mother, and instantly falls into strong convulsions. A general exclamation of astonishment burst from the company. Into strong convulsions, repeated Mr. Lillyvick, regarding them with a rigid look. Kenwigs will excuse my saying, in the presence of friends, that there was a very great objection to him, on the ground that he was beneath the family and would disgrace it. You remember, Kenwigs? Certainly, replied that gentleman, in no way displeased at the reminiscence, inasmuch as it proved, beyond all doubt, what a high family Mrs. Kenwigs came of. I shared in that feeling, said Mr. Lillyvick. Perhaps it was natural, perhaps it wasn't. A general murmur seemed to say that, in one in Mr. Lillyvick's station, the objection was not only natural, but highly praiseworthy. I came round to him in time, said Mr. Lillyvick. After they were married, and there was no help for it, I was one of the first to say that Kenwigs must be taken notice of. The family did take notice of him in consequence, and on my representation, and I am bound to say, and proud to say, that I have always found him a very honest, well-behaved, upright, respectable sort of man. Kenwigs, shake hands. I am proud to do it, sir, said Mr. Kenwigs. So am I, Kenwigs, rejoined Mr. Lillyvick. A very happy life I have led with your niece, sir, said Kenwigs. It would have been your own fault if you had not, sir, remarked Mr. Lillyvick. Morlena Kenwigs, cried her mother at this crisis, much affected. Kiss your dear uncle. The young lady did as she was requested, and the 3 other little girls, who were successfully hoisted up to the collector's countenance, and subjected to the same process, which was afterwards repeated on them by the majority of those present. Oh dear, Mrs. Kenwigs, said Miss Petowker, while Mr. Noggs is making that punch to drink happy returns in, do let Morlena go through that figure dance before Mr. Lillyvick. No, no, my dear, replied Mrs. Kenwigs. It will only worry my uncle. It can't worry him, I am sure, said Mrs. Petowker. You'll be very much pleased, won't you, sir? That I am, sure I shall, replied the collector, glancing at the punch-mixer. Well, then, I'll tell you what, said Mrs. Kenwigs. Morlena shall do the steps, if uncle can persuade Miss Toker to recite us the blood-drinker's burial afterwards. There was a great clapping of hands and stamping of feet at this proposition, the subject whereof gently inclined her head several times in acknowledgment of the reception. You know, said Miss Petowker reproachfully, that I dislike doing anything professional in private parties. Oh, but not here, said Miss Kenwigs. We are all so very friendly and pleasant that you might as well be going through it in your own room. Besides the occasion— I can't resist that, interrupted Miss Petowker. Anything in my humble power I shall be delighted to do. Mrs. Kenwigs and Miss Petowker had arranged a small program of the entertainments between them, of which this was the prescribed order, but they had settled to have a little pressing on both sides, because it looked more natural. The company being all ready, Miss Petowker hummed a tune, and Morlena danced a dance, having previously had the soles of her shoes chalked, with as much care as if she were going on a tightrope. It was a very, very beautiful figure, comprising a great deal of work for the arms, and was received with unbounded applause. If I was blessed with a child, said Miss Petowker, blushing, of such genius as that, I would have her out at the opera instantly. Mrs. Kenwigs sighed and looked at Mr. Kenwigs, who shook his head and observed that he was doubtful about it. Kenwigs is afraid, said Mrs. K. What of? Inquired Miss Petowker. Not of her failing. Oh, no, replied Mrs. Kenwigs, but if she grew up what she is now, only think of the young dukes and marquises. Very right, said the collector. Still, submitted Miss Petowker, if she took a proper pride in herself, you know. There's a good deal in that, observed Miss Kenwigs, looking at her husband. I only know, faltered Miss Petowker. It may be no rule, to be sure, but I have never found any inconvenience or unpleasantness of that sort. Mr. Kenwigs, with becoming gallantry, said that settled the question at once, and that he would take the subject into his serious consideration. This being resolved upon, Miss Petowker was entreated to begin the blood-drinker's burial, to which end that young lady let down her back hair, and taking up her position at the other end of the room, with the bachelor friend posted in a corner, to rush out at the cue in Death Expire and catch her in his arms when she died raving mad, went through the performance with extraordinary spirit, and to the great terror of the little Kinswigses, who were all but frightened into fits. The ecstasies consequent upon the effort had not yet subsided, and Newman, who had not been thoroughly sober at so late an hour for a long, long time, had not yet been able to put in a word of announcement that the punch was ready, when a hasty knock was heard at the room door, which elicited a shriek from Mrs. Kenwigs, who immediately divined that the baby had fallen out of bed. "Who is that?" demanded Mr. Kenwigs sharply. "Don't be alarmed, it's only me," said Crowell, looking in his nightcap. "The baby is very comfortable, for I peeped into the room as I came down, and it's fast asleep, and so is the girl, and I don't think the candle will set fire to the bed curtain, unless a draught was to get into the room. It's Mr. Noggs that's wanted." "Me?" cried Newman, much astonished. "Why, it is a queer hour, isn't it?" replied Crowell, who was not best pleased at the prospect of losing his fire. "And they are queer-looking people, too, all covered with rain and mud. Shall I tell them to go away?" "No," said Newman, rising. "People? How many?" "Two," rejoined Crowell. "Want me? By name?" asked Newman. "By name," replied Crowell. "Mr. Newman Noggs, as pat as need be." Newman reflected for a few seconds, then hurried away, muttering that he would be back directly. He was as good as his word, for in an exceedingly short time he burst into the room, and seizing without a word of apology or explanation a lighted candle and tumbler of hot punch from the table, darted away like a madman. "What the deuce is the matter with him?" exclaimed Crowell, throwing the door open. "Hark! Is there any noise above?" The guests rose in great confusion, and looking in each other's faces with much perplexity and some fear, stretched their necks forward and listened attentively. And that is the end of the chapter, and since we're within 10 minutes of the end of the stream, I think we'll stop there and chat for a few more minutes, give people time to hit that goal. I'll refresh the Patreon and see where we're at. All right, we've got one new patron. Thank you very, very much for that. Let's see if I can find out who that was. Hey, we've got a Meg. Meg subscribed. Thank you so much, Meg. Although I think you went to bed. But should you, in fact, still be listening, thank you very much for the sub. Do we have two more? She did not sub. She did not go to bed. She did not which? Because I can see her on the list. Oh. Okay. Baby bunnies. Yay, baby bunnies. All right. Does anybody else want to see me play Phasmo? What do you think? No, it's 2 days from Blood Moon. Okay. Yeah, we've been playing 7 Days to Die on a rando server. It's actually been pretty fun. I've got this awesome spear that I put together. I can stabby catch on fire all the zombies. So we've been running around stabbing hordes of zombies with the flaming spear. And I finally found a couple of guns. I've been stocking up ammo for like the last couple play sessions, but it was only today that I actually found guns I could use it for. I played that for about 20 minutes before the stream. But, all right. Well, I hope everybody's enjoying the story so far, and it looks like Nicholas is probably the one who landed on Newman Nogg's door. I'm guessing. I don't know who else would show up muddy in the middle of the evening looking for him. If you recall, Newman gave him a letter saying how to get in touch with him if he was back in London. So next week we should find out more about what's going to happen there. Tomorrow we are doing the watch party. That'll be at, I think, 4 p.m. Pacific time. Is that right, Vela? 4 to 6 Pacific time, right? There's still a chance to vote in the Discord on what movie you want to watch. There were 3 that we were looking at. There was Inception, Journey to the Center of the Earth, and How to Train Your Dragon. Although personally I'm leaning a bit towards How to Train Your Dragon unless we get a bunch of people voting against that. So if there's a tie, that'll be my tiebreaker. Hey, I will go where the votes go. If there is a majority for Journey to the Center of the Earth, I will go for that one. You count for 2? Maybe. Maybe. All right. Well, I really enjoyed this. You guys more than made up for... Hey, Zippy. Glad you're here. Hope you enjoyed the stream today. But this is more than made up for the start of my morning trying to teach trigonometry to a teenage girl. Oof. Little dude and used to. Well, I mean, yeah, okay, I can buy that. Tell him to click that reaction button in the Discord. But, yeah. No, you guys have made my day a lot better. Thank you for that. I really enjoyed reading to you. And thank you for joining me. Now, if you haven't joined the Discord yet or clicked that follow button, please do so. There's a little purple follow button below the stream on Twitch, and there's the link to join the Discord. You've achieved what goal? And there's also the YouTube channel if you want to catch some of the older content that's already aged out of Twitch. Thank you. I appreciate that very much. But thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you tomorrow for the watch party. Remember, you will need to link your Amazon Prime account to your Twitch in order to be able to watch the movie. So do that before you join the stream to cut down on the technical difficulties time. And come jump in and join us in the Discord where we'll be chatting and hanging out together as we watch. All right. Well, have a good evening, everyone, or a good day. And those of you who want to jump in for some gaming or something, I'll be in the Discord in just a few minutes.